So we're getting to a good point in this course because now that we've talked about the basic chords, some cadences, and tendency tones, the ways that music actually work and resolve, we can start to talk about some basic progressions and a concept known as parallel 6-3 chords. And parallel 6-3 chords are going to explain a few chords that are not usually found on their own, such as a 3 chord. You're typically not going to see a 3 chord by itself, but if you see a 3-6 chord as part of a series of first inversion triads, that can explain its function when we're talking about parallel 6-3 chords. So the first type of progression you're going to find is going to be the strongest type of progression in music. We call these descending fifth progressions, and this has the strongest root motion in music because it's using the circle of fifths. So if you start in a C, your next chord might be an F. Below that would probably be a B because they tend to stay diatonic, and then we come down to an E, and then an A, and so on. Typically, once you hit a diminished triad, the progression stops because that diminished quality becomes problematic since there's so much that needs to resolve a particular way. So a descending fifth progression could circle through all the diatonic chords in a key. The shortest progressions only connect 2 chords, and those are probably going to be the most common, but a chain of 3 or 4 chords can also occur. As I said, the progressions often stop at diminished triads, or chords in general, so fully diminished seventh or a half diminished seventh. A complete progression could be a 1, 4, 7, going down to 3, 6, 2, 5, and then it cadences on the 1 chord, and that's how you sort of would end the progression. Or you might have 1, 4, 7. You could have a major 7 as well that goes down to a 3, 6, 2 diminished, 5, or 1. So if you look at these two, you can kind of ascertain that this one is dealing with a major key, and this one's dealing with a minor key. So actually, that final chord should definitely be a minor 1 chord. So just make sure that you follow the proper chords from within the diatonic key that you're dealing with. So if you want to deal with roots in C major and minor, you can think of it this way. You've got a C major triad, an F major triad. B would be diminished. Then you have an E minor, A minor, D minor, goes down to G major, and then C major. In minor, C minor, F minor, B major, or it could be diminished, E major, A major, D minor, G major, and C major. So these are all the basic triads that you can come across in the key of C if you're using a descending fifth progression. So when you're writing descending fifth progressions, you want to keep the common tone in the same voice and remove the remaining voices to the closest chord member. So if we see here, we have the G's in every single progression, except for this final one. They all move and maintain the common tone. Here you have your G held over here. Doesn't matter how you voice them, you just want to keep that common tone the same. You also want to resolve the leading tone properly and don't double any tendency tones. So if you reach a point where you actually have a tendency tone, like right here, this B natural is a tendency tone, so we can't double the root. So that requires us to kind of rethink how we're going to voice the other voices. Normally you would want to double the bass note, but again, if you have a 5-6 going to a 1, you can't double the bass because that's a leading tone. So that's just something to keep in mind. The other thing is that all the other voices should just move by step. Notice they're just moving by step. You should have complete chords, so you've got a C, C, E, and G. Doubled root, E, G. Here again, doubled root, B and D. Here you have a doubled root, a B and a D, doubled root, E and G. So all of these chords are complete chords. You really want to make sure you have complete chords whenever possible. Although there are some progressions that will leave out the fifth. And just note that this B here can't be doubled because that is the leading tone. It has to resolve. So let's say I doubled that B. Let's say I put it here in the tenor. It would have to resolve up to C. That would result in parallel octaves. So that's why we can't double that leading tone. It's also possible to have a descending fifth sequence with 7th chords. So you could either use all 7th chords or you could alternate between triads and 7th chords. The subdominant is typically not used if you do this, but it is possible. When moving from root position 5-7 to 1, you still need to make one of the chords incomplete. So for this reason, typically when we are moving from 7th chords, they alternate. So maybe you'll start with a 7th and then move to a triad, or you'll start with a triad and then move to a 7th chord. Either one is okay, but you tend to come into problems with tendency tone resolutions if you just have a series of 7th chords. So your non-dominant 7th chord resolutions, you still have to watch those. You want to approach the chordal 7th by common tone or step, whichever one that you can use. Just keep that short as possible motion, and make sure that chordal 7th resolves down anytime you have it. So whether it's a 2-7, a 4-7, or a 6-7, resolve that 7th down. If there's a leading tone involved, of course, with a 5-7, you need to resolve that as well. Another type of progression is a descending third. So it most commonly occurs in a descending relationship. Although, like the descending fifth, you can have ascending third progressions, but they're going to be much less common. With descending third progressions, we typically don't use 7th chords. That's not to say you're not going to find them, but you'd have a lot of unresolved 7ths. It can become difficult to resolve those 7ths when you move in descending thirds. The chord root serves as a basis for the descending third progression and not the bass note. So what does that mean? If you have the notes C, E, and G, that's in root position, so we use the C as the root of the chord. If we then move to a G, an E, and a C, then it's no longer in root position. You still use the root of the chord to identify whether it's a third progression and not the bass note. Even if they're in inversion, we've got to put them in root position to figure out what kind of progression we're actually dealing with. The root of the chord usually is doubled with the bass and an upper part. So typically they are in root position, but the remaining parts should just move to the closest chord member. Remember that law of the shortest way? We've got to keep doing that. As with the descending fifth, your progressions will typically stop with the onset of a diminished chord. So here's one complete progression. You could have 1 going to 6, 4, and then 2. You might then continue in the next measure. Typically we wouldn't have the 7 chord, but if you wanted to, you could continue it and have 7 going to 5, going to 3, going to 1. That would be a complete progression. But again, typically that diminished chord's problematic. The composer's really not going to use that very often. If you're in minor, it goes from 1 to 6 to 4. Then you have diminished 2 chord, diminished 7, or your major leading tone. More commonly, you're probably going to have your major leading tone in these cases, a 5, a 3, and then a 1. So really they're the same Roman numerals. It's just the quality changes depending on whether you're in major or minor. And just keep in mind that triads that are a third apart share 2 common tones, which means you can always have 2 common tones as you move down the progression. And I'm going to show you some examples of this. So here are your more common progressions. You could have 1 going to 6, going to 4. Notice that precursor to the predominant. You could have 1, 2, 6 going to a minor 4 if you're in minor. So this is a tonic to predominant relationship where your 1's a tonic and your 4 is a predominant. You could also move from a 6 to a 4 to a 2. That's pretty common. And this would serve sort of a predominant function. And you could move from 2 to a leading tone chord, typically in first inversion, and that would be your predominant to a dominant. It's a dominant substitute, but it's still a dominant when you have that leading tone chord. So root motion by ascending third is going to be pretty rare. We're not really going to find that. Just like with the descending fifth progressions, those typically descend. Third progressions also typically descend. You tend to have issues with voice leading when you go the other way, and it's not as smooth. Just like with the descending fifth progressions, you want to double the root of the chord in the bass and hold any common tones, and then just move remaining parts to the closest chord member. Unlike descending fifth progressions, 7th chords are not common in third progressions, so you're not going to see too many descending third progressions, and especially not ascending third progressions using seventh chords unless you're dealing with modern music. So since the triads that are a third apart, they share two common tones, your descending third progressions are typically found in root position, since it's traditional to double the root of the bass in a descending third progression. So just keep that in mind. So here, we have a 1 chord going down to a 6 chord. So notice that descending third in the bass, even if the C wasn't in the bass, let's say this G was in the bass and the C was in the tenor, it would still be a descending third progression, even if we were using an inversion. So keep that in mind. It's not the bass note that determines it, it's the chord quality and the root of the chord. So here, just notice how we have two common tones, they're held over. And here, you just move the remaining voice by step. You want to have a complete chord. So if we double the bass, you have a C here and a C here, then you have your E and your G. So here you have an A, you double the bass, we have another A there, and then the other two chord tones just hold their position. So then if you want to go from a 6 chord to a 4 chord, you could just move by step, hold that common tone in two voices, and come down another third. So again, we want to double that bass, so the 4, the F in the 4 chord is doubled, and then here the 2 chord, the D is doubled, and then you just fill in the remaining chord tones. So we have an F and an A here, so we need a C, so we can put that here to allow for that common tone relationship, and then it just moves up by step to fill in the D to double the D of the 2 chord. So they're actually pretty easy to write. There shouldn't be any real problems as long as you just keep the common tone, move everything else by step, and have complete chords and double the bass. Now we're dealing with the ascending second. So unlike the descending fifth and the descending third, which can also be found ascending, but they're most commonly going to be found descending, the ascending second is rarely found descending. So this one's sort of set apart from the other two, and that we normally find it ascending. It's typically used to connect phrase areas, such as the tonic and the dominant, the predominant to the dominant, or the dominant back to the tonic. In modern music, chords generally just move up or down a step. We don't worry about whether or not that root and fifth are forming parallel fifths or octaves. If we double the root, we'd have parallel octaves. They tend to not worry so much about that because our modern ears don't necessarily have an objection to parallel fifths and octaves like we did back in the 16th and 18th centuries. You move the upper voices in contrary motion if you do want to avoid this parallel motion, and you move them in contrary motion to the bass to avoid parallels. So modern music may simply move the entire chord up by step, like I said, but what that does is it reduces the independence of the voices, which might be desirable in certain instances. So if we look at this, we have our 1 chord. We've got C, E, and G. We double the root, and then here we double the root of the 2 chord, so we have that D, but then all the voices are moving in contrary motion to the bass. That's sort of ideal. And notice what happens as a result. Since we have the doubled root, we need an F, we need the third, and we need an A. So what that means is this C has to skip down. So that often happens. You're going to have a skip in the chord progression. Same thing happens with 4 to 5. You skip whatever note you double on the first beat, ends up skipping down. So here we doubled the C, so the root of the chord skips down a third into the next chord. Root of the chord here, it's doubled, we skip down, and we just fill in the remaining voices. And make sure you go contrary motion. Here, you have a 7 going to a 1. This is actually an example of an ascending second. And in this case, we don't want to double that bass note because it is going to create a strong tritone relationship between the B and the F. So what do we do instead? We double the third. And then this one actually allows us to move in stepwise motion. So the third, this one comes down and the other one goes up, which gives us a complete chord. And you'll notice on the 1 chord, the C is doubled again. So we have a C, an E, and a G. So the 7 moving to 1 is a little bit problematic because of the bass note, But if you remember that you don't double the bass of a diminished triad, you always double the third, sometimes the fifth, then you should be able to avoid issues with this. Also, the 7 chord, since it's diminished, we try to avoid using it in an ascending second progression. So here, last one, notice the root is doubled, the G, and it just skips down a third. The other voices just move by step. Now in this particular one, we don't have contrary motion to the bass, but it doesn't pose any problem because we don't have any parallel fifths or octaves to worry about. The mediant triad is actually a little bit unusual and it's not used that often in music. A few things to note. It shares 2 chord members with both the tonic and the dominant. That makes it a really ambiguous chord. So unlike the 2 and the 4 chord that share 2 common tones, and the 5 and the leading tone chord that share 2 common tones, since the 3 chord shares tones with both the tonic, which is a very functional, important chord, and the dominant, it really creates ambiguity in the music. So because of that, it doesn't really function as a tonic substitute, and it doesn't function as a substitute for the dominant either. If you come across a 3 chord, just check to make sure you're really dealing with a 3 chord. It typically appears in only a few instances. One would be if it's part of a 1, 3, 4 progression at the beginning of the phrase. So if this is the beginning of the phrase and you see 1, 3, 4, then it's probably a true 3 chord. But you wouldn't typically find the 3 chord in the middle of the phrase because that would be creating too much ambiguity. You may also see it as part of a sequence. So if it's part of a sequence, then the composer did it because the sequence and the voice leading of a sequence is more powerful than the ambiguity of the 3 chord. So because of that, we're allowed to sort of ignore the fact that there's a 3 chord there because once again, voice leading becomes more important. If you see it set in a 1-7-6 soprano line like you see here, here's 1, 7, and then 6, check to see if the offbeat is a passing tone and if it's actually a 1, 1, 6, 4 progression. In this instance, we'd rather view this as a non-chord tone and say this is a 1, 1, 6, 4 progression. So it typically serves as a tonic expansion from 1 moving into 3, so that would be part of the tonic expansion, and then here we might hit our predominant. And it can substitute for 1, 6. So if we look at these 2 chord progressions, they're almost the same. Here we have that E holding over comes down to C in the alto. E holds over comes down to C. The tenor, the bass, everything's the same. The only thing that changes is just this one note on the downbeat. So it's a really successful substitute for 1-6 when you really want to create ambiguity. And for that reason, it wasn't used too often in the classical period. So another thing that's a little less common is the minor dominant. You can find it in a few different contexts. You might find it in the middle of a phrase in a minor key, but you're not going to find it at a cadence since it lacks the leading tone, because that leading tone is going to be flat. You will often find it in a lament, so the 1, 5, 6, 4, 6, 5 progression will often use the minor dominant, because in this instance we don't want to emphasize that 5 chord, so it's a perfect 6-3 progression. Notice how this is a first inversion triad and this is a first inversion triad, and that's also a typical lament progression. And you also might find it in a series of parallel 6-3 chords, and this is going to be the most common way you find both your 3 chord and your minor dominant, as I'm going to show you in the next slide. So here, the mediant triad and minor dominant may appear in a series of parallel 6-3 chords. So you can notate a series of parallel 6-3 chords by identifying the first and last 6-3 chord. So here I have a 1-6 chord, and then I have all these first inversion triads. We don't actually have to analyze all these chords. What we could do is just draw a line, write parallel 6-3 chords to indicate what we're dealing with, and then keep the line going until the final 6-3 chord. And you'll notice here we don't have an example of a minor dominant, but this 3-6 chord works because it's part of a 6-3 progression. So these parallel 6-3 chords occur fairly commonly in music, and if you find them, it can explain why you have a 3 chord. So if you see a series of 6 chords here, first inversion triads, then you know that that 3 chord is a legitimate 3 chord. So that's the importance of the parallel 6-3 chord, and I hope this all was useful for you. We're going to get into some more topics in the next lecture.